Bună dimineața tuturor, stimați colegi, oaspeți de peste hotare și domnilor experți, stimați colegi deputați, stimați membri ai societăților civile și partenerilor de dezvoltare. Vă salut și vă felicit cu prezența și organizarea acestui eveniment important care va puncta anumite elemente importante din politicile din domeniul drogurilor din Republica Moldova și acest eveniment poate fi afiliat și zilei de 26 iunie, care este declarată ziua combaterii traficului și combaterii de droguri, consumului de droguri. În cadrul acestei ședințe, numeroși actori ce țin de Parlament, ministere, parteneri de dezvoltare, societatea civilă, experți de peste hotare, vor analiza politicile antidrog implementate în Republica Moldova și vor discuta strategiile de îmbunătățire a acestora prin prisma legislației Uniunii Europene, a angajamentelor naționale și internaționale a Republicii Moldova și va fi un schimb de opinii și experiențe care vor pune bazele unor soluții mai eficiente în politicile din domeniul care urmează a fi implementate sau optimizate. În acest context, vreau să vă mulțumesc pentru prezență, pentru contribuția tuturor și haideți să considerăm acest eveniment oficial deschis și îi ofer cu această ocazie cuvântul doamnei vicepreședintă a Comisiei pentru protecție socială, sănătate și familie, doamnei Liliana Grosu.
Mulțumesc, domnul Belăi, vă salut și eu pe toți cu mult drag în Parlamentul Republicii Moldova. Vă mulțumesc pentru că ați răspuns invitației Comisiei Protecție Socială, Sănătate și Familie de a participa la acest dialog intersectorial. Problema consumului de droguri și a traficului ilicit de droguri este una foarte acută pentru țara noastră, dar și pentru toate țările. Din acest punct de vedere, soluțiile pentru a rezolva această problemă nu sunt simple, ele întotdeauna presupun un efort comun și efortul ăsta trebuie să fie permanent și coordonat. Este foarte important ca astăzi să reușim să avem un schimb de opinii și să vorbim despre eforturile și evoluțiile care s-au produs în Republica Moldova pe acest subiect. Și mulțumesc reprezentanților instituțiilor statului, în special Ministerului de Interne, Ministerului Sănătății, care au făcut probabil cel mai mare efort în ultimul timp ca să îmbunătățească lucrurile. Totodată este necesar să vedem care pot fi următorii pași pe care îi putem întreprinde la nivel național. Și le mulțumesc experților din Cehia, Lituania, Estonia, care o să ne prezinte experiența lor, pentru că știm că în aceste țări s-au produs cu mai mulți ani în urmă anumite lucruri care au îmbunătățit situația, a redus numărul de consumatori de droguri și a redus oferta de droguri prin combaterea traficului ilicit și asta o să ne ajute pe noi ca stat să înțelegem ce trebuie să facem în continuare. Acestea fiind spuse, vă propun să începem prin a cunoaște experiența, sau mai bine zis, datele unui studiu regional care a fost realizat, dar prezentarea de astăzi va fi axată mai mult pe evaluarea lucrurilor din Republica Moldova și eu cred că această prezentare care va fi realizată de Eliza Curcevic va prezenta interes pentru noi toți. Așa că, Eliza, îți oferim cuvântul.
Dear colleagues, thank you very much for the opportunity and for the invitation to be here in Moldova, in Parliament. It's a great pleasure to be here and to discuss with you such an important topics which are actually day to day are increasing and more discussions are coming up. Yesterday we had a preparatory meeting also where we discussed also some issues on harm reduction, public health, and we were speaking and mentioning such topics as young people who are using drugs, synthetic drugs coming into the market. So keeping all this in mind, I think it's so important today to be here, to sit here and discuss it all together among the main stakeholders who are working in this field. So, as I was already introduced, my name is Eliza Kurtsevich. I'm from Lithuania, from the Eurasian Harm Reduction Association. We are NGO working in the Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia region, so in 29 countries. And today I would like to present and speak a little bit about the EU accession. Moldova is one of the countries in the region which is now seeking EU member state status, so one of the three countries, and very recently we developed a report which is called, as you see, Associated Trio Accelerating Accession of Georgia, Moldova and Ukraine to the EU. And we specifically focused in this report on criminal drug law and policy dimension, because that's also a topic which is not that much probably, you know, showed or discussed, but it's still part of the EU accession process, and it shouldn't be skipped in a broader and wider discussions when we speak overall about EU accession. So that's just a timeline, and I'm pretty sure that all of you know it perfectly because you are from Moldova, you know how everything happened. So now we are at this stage where formal start of accession negotiations already started. And I won't focus on this historical perspective, key milestones. I will go straight forward to our report to speak about the drug policy dimension which we analyzed. I won't be speaking about Ukraine or Georgia, as today it's not relevant. However, if you will be interested to learn also more about these countries in our report, you can read it. So speaking about the stability of democratic institutions. So as you might know, the EU accession process, reforming drug laws, can contribute actually to the improving the stability of countries' democratic institutions, and it can happen in several ways. So first of all, I would like to mention reduction in corruption. So strict and punitive repressive drug laws, they actually often create opportunities for corruption within the law enforcement and judicial institutions. I'm sure that loads of you heard of cases when law enforcement, so police officers or in the courts, judges are getting some bribes, you know, to make the decisions like in other way than it's written in the laws. Why it's happening? Like, is it normal practice? Of course, it's not normal. It's not transparent. It's not working according to the democratic principles of the country itself. So that's why the change of punitive drug laws to more humane drug policies, which are evidence-based, which are focusing on individual, which are focusing actually on the public health itself and helping a person, can reduce the corruption in the country. Enhanced rule of the law. So punitive drug laws sometimes can lead to arbitrary or selective enforcement, and this is undermining the rule of law. When drug laws are reformed to be more rational and proportionate, it can foster a sense of fairness and equality under the law. And this contributes to trust in the legal system by citizens, by community, and that's also a very critical aspect of a stable democracy. Respect for human rights. So definitely when we speak about drug policies, we should always speak about human rights, because people who use drugs, they belong to so-called marginalized communities. And we know that marginalized communities, they are sensitive, and their rights are breached in many various ways, starting from the accessibility to services, or probably I should say non-accessibility to public health services, and then going to the arbitrary arrests, which can happen, I know, just in the streets, you know, when the law enforcement can stop a person just because how he or she looks like. So stringent drug policies can result actually in human rights abuses, in the overcrowded prisons, in the arbitrary arrests, violation of individual rights and freedoms. Reforms that prioritize harm reduction, so public health approach and rights-based approach, they can ensure that individual human rights are upheld, and it's also aligning definitely with the democratic principles. Resource allocation. Nowadays, in many countries, loads of resources are invested into the punishments, into the sanctions when we speak about drug use. So basically, to keep person in prison, governments think that keep person in prison is better and more financial, easier than to support that person in freedom. I would like here to share, just a second, this map. So that's a criminalization cost map, which in my association we are renewing each 2 years, and the last renewed data is from 2023. So it's showing basically Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia comparison of how much does it cost for the government to keep one person in prison, and how much does it cost for the government to keep the same person in community, in society, but pay for that person's health, even unemployment benefit, I know, opioid agonist treatment if that person needs. So speaking about Moldova, you can see that, oh, sorry, I don't know why it's, yeah. So speaking about Moldova, you can see that the difference is 6 times. So basically, to keep person in Moldova in prison, it costs almost 4,000 euros per year per person, while keep the same person here in community and provide unemployment or social benefit, to give that person opioid agonist therapy, provide needle syringe program or so-called low threshold facilities, it costs approximately like 631 euro. You can also here see in the map differences like in other countries. So there are definitely countries which have like even higher differences, such as Georgia, for example, like it's 14 times. But mainly that's something what I wanted to say when we speak about resource allocation. And that's a question for all of us, like, do we really need and want to invest into prisons and prison overcrowding for small crimes such as possession of small amounts for personal use? Or do we want to help people who use drugs, those who have illnesses, to get better future and to integrate them into the society? The 2 more principles, like democratic principles, it's definitely public trust and engagement. So when drug policies are perceived as overly punitive or ineffective, it can erode public trust in government institutions. Reform efforts that are evidence-based and responsive to public health concerns are more likely to garner public support and engagement with the democratic process. Reforms can win public trust actually as well when the communities of people affected by drug problems are meaningfully engaged in the process of law and policy reforms. And also it's very important, of course, to include community-led monitoring initiatives. So it's very actually nice to see in this discussion as well people from institutions included, people from the civil society, from the community of people who use drugs, and more such initiatives are definitely welcome, especially when the policies are developed and made. It's very, you know, like there is such a saying in our movement of drug policies, nothing about us without us. So how governments can create policies without including those people from the key populations? It's very important to include them into the policy-making processes because it affects their lives. So please do not forget this. And the last principle which I wanted to mention, it's law enforcement and criminal justice system efficiency. So we understand probably, and that's an issue also in Lithuania, like I could share like from my country's practice. More like if police will concentrate on catching in the streets young people or like whatever people with small amounts of drugs, it means that our justice system will never be able to concentrate on very serious cases, and it will take so many years for justice system, for the courts to work on much more serious cases than, you know, like a possession of small amounts of drugs. So overburdened criminal justice systems can hinder the proactive enforcement of fundamental laws and timely resolution of cases and contribute also to backlogs in courts. So drug law reform can elevate these strains, allowing the law enforcement and justice system to focus on more pressing matters and operate more efficiently. This slide, I won't be going that much into detail. It's just information about the association agreement. So definitely Moldova with EU has association agreement, and it does include some specific clause about the drug use, like drug-related issues. So for example, Article 16, it's mainly focusing on smuggling and trafficking goods and how the cooperation should happen on this, and how the prevention and combating of this traffic should happen. Then there is Article 17, which speaks that parties shall cooperate on the balanced approach and integrated approach towards drug issues and drug policies. And there is Article 113 and 114, which also speaks about cooperation when we speak about communicable diseases such as HIV/AIDS. So I think that Article 113 and 14 are mainly focusing on the public health approaches, harm reduction, and then Article 17 are also on the drug policies, making it more balanced and proportionate and evidence-based. What are the recommendations and what we want to say, to notice? So immediate priorities for drug law and policy reforms, we underline like 3 of them for 3 countries, Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia, because this report was made for 3 countries. So first of all, inadequate threshold quantities. Moldova, as well as Ukraine and Georgia, have the issue that when a person with drugs is caught, arrested, usually the total weight of seized substance is counted, you know. So nobody is checking whether this substance which was taken from the person has maybe sugar, maybe has vitamin C, which are actually legal substances. In Lithuania, and I know that today after lunch, after the break, my colleague will be speaking from the Law Institute. He will be speaking that, for example, in Lithuania, when a person is arrested with a substance, the substances are weighed and analyzed, like what's inside the substance. And it might be that it's, I know, like 2 grams of MDMA. It can be also 1 gram of vitamin C. It can be 10 grams of sugar there. So definitely sugar will be eliminated when the, you know, like final decision will be made while giving like a sentence to a person, because sugar is not a legal substance. So small threshold makes it easier also for the law enforcement to meet performance targets by concentrating on individuals using drugs. So law enforcement definitely will be trying to catch these people who are having and holding small quantities instead of going and trying to find like huge drug traffickers, because it's much easier to catch a person like with a smaller amount of drugs, rather, you know, like close all the, I know, traffickers unit. The second point, which I would like to say, it's about lack of wholesale commercial traffic definition. So when we see these threshold quantities tables, they usually have, you know, division between like small, large, very large amounts. And it's interesting sometimes to see, for example, very large amount to be counted from, let's say, 1 gram of heroin to like 40 kilograms heroin. So how you can, you know, how you can compare actually 1 gram of heroin and 40 kilograms. There definitely should be like a wholesale commercial trafficking definition developed and included into the national legislation. It is more convenient for law enforcement also to prosecute individuals which are trafficking like small amounts of drugs. And underdeveloped drug referral practices. So it's more about like public health approach. So that's about police when they arrest a person, and possibility of police to refer person, for example, to the public health institutions, rather to putting that person, you know, like under the criminal case, then like to the prison, etc. Nowadays, now I don't remember how it's in Moldova, but we do have countries like Estonia, we do have even in Lithuania some practices when law enforcement, police can bring a person to the public health institution, definitely like on voluntary basis, and help that person to receive opioid agonist treatment or any other kind of support that person needs. So in that case, law enforcement is actively included in all that process. But the problem with this in most of the countries is that there is a limited number of places, you know, how many people can be brought to those medical institutions for the support and help. So that's, again, very important to review in the laws the possibility to have no limitations for that. So if person wants to be referred for the consultation with psychiatrists or with the peer-to-peer educator, they should be given this possibility. I have 2 more slides. It's about reform, criminal law and policy reform recommendations here in Moldova. On which articles we should be focusing and what should be changed. So there is a chapter which is focusing on the concerning drug use related behavior. So it's mainly about like drug use. So our recommendation definitely would be to repeal the sections in whole or in part where no intent to sell is stipulated. The criminal law is grossly disproportionate response to offenses unrelated to drug trafficking or the distribution of drugs where necessary and appropriate, consider moving these type of offenses into the Code of Administrative Offenses with such sanctions as a warning or other non-custodial sanctions when punishment is warranted by the amount in possession or other circumstances. Prescribe a variety of treatment alternatives to sanctions to establish a toolbox of incentives for people whose conflict with legislation is underpinned by substance dependence. Introduce non-criminal justice measures to prevent people from using drugs, and it can be actually informed by such sources as European Drug Prevention Quality Standards and European Prevention Curriculum developed by EMCDDA, today already EUDA. Criminal law and policy reform recommendations which are focusing on the distribution and trafficking of illicit drugs. So that's another part, right, which is focusing mainly on trafficking and distribution with purpose to sell the substances. So our recommendations here would be introduce the element of wholesale drug trafficking for the purpose of systemic enrichment into the definition of this crime. This element can help define the trafficking offense that should be in the focus of drug enforcement. Also introduce this definition into the criminal code and as a separate article with offenses of illicit distribution of drugs, psychotropic substances, their analogs, with no element of wholesale drug trafficking for the purposes of systemic enrichment. Consider such offenses under the category of less serious criminal offenses depending on the type of substance, the quantity of substances of distribution, and other circumstances. Yes, thank you very much. That's it from my side.
Mulțumim, Eliza, pentru realizarea acestui studiu și prezentarea constatărilor care țin de Republica Moldova. Stimați colegi, vă propun să avem și o etapă de discuții după fiecare prezentare. Cu siguranță, datele pe care le-ați auzit, sugestiile, recomandările, au trezit anumite reflexii, întrebări, comentarii. Așa că vă rog, cine dorește să vorbească, porniți microfonul și începem discuția.
Bună ziua! Здравствуйте, коллеги. Меня зовут Пайрог Руслан, я представляю организацию «Позитивная инициатива». Я не очень понимаю формат, в котором можно сейчас обсуждать, но в продолжение вот этой презентации, которая очень так точечно, четко обращает внимание на определенные вещи, хочу по-своему обратить ваше внимание на эту же ситуацию. Суть заключается в том, что наркотики были, есть и будут. Увы, это факт. А вопрос остается, как же взаимодействовать с этим феноменом, как контролировать, либо как-то регулировать. И это вопрос, который необходимо задавать нам. То есть какой мы выбор выбираем? В сторону отрицания, либо идти в сторону контроля, регулирования. Так вот, если про контроль и регулирование сегодня говорили про дозы, про количество веществ, знаете, что самое страшное? Мы вообще понятия не имеем, что там продают и извиняюсь, какой отравой размешали отраву. Мы вообще об этом вообще не думаем. А это вообще огромнейшая проблема. Я не говорю сейчас, что это должна стать приоритетной темой, заботиться о качестве наркотиков и все остальное. Но не об этом. Но это вопрос, который требует внимания. Потому что на сегодняшний день я думаю, что фактом является то, что из-за качества той самой отравы, которая разбавляют наркотики, умирает, скорее всего, больше, чем от передозов и всего остального. Следующий момент. Контролируем ли мы ситуацию, о которой говорили сегодня, что является первичной помощью или наказанием? Мои коллеги сейчас сопровождают дело определенное, когда девушка вызвала скорую помощь. Приехала полиция. Скорая приехала где-то часа через полтора, когда все-таки пытались дозвониться. То есть интересует ли нас на самом деле тот факт, что люди попадают в тюрьму из-за того, что у него какая-то маленькая доза, давайте той же самой каннабиса, который все мы понимаем, что кто-то где-то как-то это употребляет. Это не плюс, это не витаминки. Это наркотики точно так же, как вред, как алкоголь и все остальное. Но люди попадают в тюрьму. И это вообще ненормально, потому что во-первых, мы содержим их там в 6 раз больше, тратим денег. А это что ж не инвестиции ни в жизнь этого человека, ни в общество в целом. Ну и последний момент, мы понимаем, что мы как раз создаем те самые условия, когда, будучи в экономическом положении и во всем остальном, люди начинают использовать в своих каких-то целях вот те самые моменты. Вот это такие маленькие, короткие штрихи, и мы рано или поздно с этой ситуацией разберемся. Это факт. Мы же понимаем, человечество двигается в определенном направлении. Вопрос только когда. А вот ответ нужно искать в плоскости того, сколько каждый день там людей умирает, сколько людей попадают за решетку, сколько людей закладывают квартиры, чтобы как-то рассчитаться за дело, которое было открыто. Вот всегда вопрос только в этом. Спасибо большое.
Bună ziua! Și vă salut cu foarte mult respect și recunoștință pentru această posibilitate de reunire a noastră și în acest format, pentru că ne regăsim acum în mai multe formate și asta este bine pentru că discutăm la diferite niveluri și diferite componente ale politicilor antidrog în Republica Moldova. Acum mulțumesc Comisiei Parlamentare în special pentru organizarea ședinței și a dialogului. Eliza a punctat foarte bine două lucruri distincte, două fapte distincte care există în acest domeniu și pe care trebuie să le luăm în considerație. Pe de o parte este consumul, pe de o parte este traficul. Și abordările față de aceste două comportamente trebuie să fie diferite. Și legislația trebuie să prevadă măsuri diferite. Raportul pe care îl realizase Asociația Euro-Asiatică de Reducere a Riscurilor ne recomandă să facem distincție dintre comerțul cu amănuntul, care presupune consumul de droguri și faptul că persoana este constrânsă să continue să o facă, și comerțul angro, traficul, altfel zis. Și acest lucru este posibil și la nivel de legislație, de făcut prin a delimita acele, ele și acum la noi sunt delimitate, doar că acest amănunt este angro la noi. De fapt, la noi amănunt nu există. La noi, practic, totul este angro pentru că oamenii pentru totul sunt pedepsiți. Este bine să delimităm mai bine aceste lucruri, inclusiv din perspectiva articolelor pe care le avem în legislație. Și atunci când nu este intenția de îmbogățire, când noi înțelegem că noi avem o înțelegere a faptului cât constituie acel volum pe care îl consumă omul zilnic și probabil că el deține pentru câteva zile. Și dacă noi înțelegem că nu este vorba de îmbogățire, dar este vorba de o constrângere sub forma dependenței pe care are, sau poate nu este dependență, dar este un comportament care este în curs, este un adolescent, este o persoană tânără care experimentează, atunci aplicăm unele măsuri. Atunci când noi înțelegem că acest fapt ține de îmbogățire și de încercarea de a comercializa acest produs, atunci aplicăm alte măsuri. De asta această inițiativă care există și pe care noi să ajungem să o discutăm privind modificarea legislativă, legii 382, este foarte, foarte binevenită. Și acum este acea oportunitate unică să nu omitem acea oportunitate împreună cu legea 382, revizuită sau în forma nouă în care să apară. Să ținem cont de toate aceste elemente ca ele să regăsească. Noi avem mai multe lucruri pe care vrem să le revedem acolo, și strategii, și entitate, dar și această parte cu cantitățile, acea listă, da, pe care noi vrem să o revizuim și o să ajungem mai departe să o discutăm astăzi. Pentru că sunt oportunități unice. Legile se revăd, deci odată la câțiva ani sau la foarte mulți ani. De asta, mie mi se pare foarte clare concluziile acestui raport și cu recomandări foarte clare, inclusiv pe articole care pot fi modificate într-o formă sau alta, așa cum este acceptabil țării noastre. Și noi avem acest articol disponibil, o să putem să-l transmitem după ședință pentru o analiză mai detaliată. Mulțumesc!
Da, mulțumim! Este important să avem acces și noi la acest raport mai detaliat ca să-l examinăm. Colegi, mai are cineva vreo intervenție? Poftim!
În primul rând, mulțumim pentru organizarea ședinței date. Mă numesc Alexandru Bugă, reprezint agenția ONU, UNODC. Vreau doar să spun că sistemul penitenciar, în contextul reducerii riscurilor în Republica Moldova este unul exemplu. Și recent a fost o vizită din străinătate, unde a fost inclusiv și vizita în penitenciar, unde în cadrul vizitei s-a demonstrat că avem puncte de schimb de seringi. Deci asta este o practică bună. La un moment dat cineva a întrebat cum este posibil ca în cadrul penitenciarului să fie distribuite seringele. Înseamnă că în penitenciar se consumă droguri. Deci, ceea ce am vrut să spun că faptul că persoana este dusă în detenție, ea oricum va consuma, deci nu se rezolvă problema. Eu de profesie sunt medic și starea pe care are o persoană, dacă nu îi se oferă tratament, este o stare de sevraj, este analogic cum ar avea o hipertensiune arterială sau o durere. Deci, doar ca să adaug la ce s-a spus, că încarcerarea nu este o soluție. Deci, într-adevăr, acum avem momentul de a modifica, de a îmbunătăți, fiindcă este experiența altor țări. Mulțumesc!
Da, poftim.
Bună ziua, dacă tot am fost vizați. Vlad Dușmăchiu, Administrația Națională a Penitenciarilor, membru corespondent permanent al grupului Pompidou. Vă mulțumesc pentru această ocazie de a participa. Este foarte important de menționat din propria mea viziune. Este remarcabil faptul că în ultimii un an jumate s-au activat factorii de decizii și părțile cointeresate în politicii național antidrog și ședințele. Cred că este contextul aderării la Uniunea Europeană și este foarte important și sunt sigur că noi conștientizăm că acesta este un moment de răscruce pentru Republica Moldova ce ține în politicile antidrog. De noi depinde în următorii ani în ce direcție vom merge. Desigur, este foarte important suportul partenerilor de dezvoltare. Raportul este foarte comprehensiv și interesant, ceea ce putem noi să preluăm anumite date ca să ne facem un roadmap, să zic, unde vrem noi să mergem. Da, desigur, eu cred că este o abordare comprehensivă și holistică asupra acestui subiect. Chiar recent, în cadrul unei ședințe a punctului de grup, ce ține de domeniul criminal justice, în Belgia, în cadrul unui proiect, de asemenea, a avut problema aceasta încarcerării. Da, noi avem și suntem unic din regiune și din puținele din lume în care avem schimbul de seringi, dar totuși cred că deja noi toți știm și nu trebuie să repetăm că este o problemă de sănătate și oamenii trebuie tratați, nu pedepsiți superior, plus la pedeapsa care au deja cu stigmatizarea fiind consumatori. Și în cadrul acestui proiect în Belgia s-a început cu judecăți specializate pentru anumite categorii de persoane de consumatori. Ei deja sunt la al 3-lea an și au prezentat-o ca un succes. În cadrul acestor judecătorii, persoanele nu sunt pedepsite cu privare de libertate, dar sunt trimiși la programe de reabilitare. Și eu cred că noi avem acum ocazia, în cadrul activității Comisiei Naționale și toate activitățile pe domeniu, să luăm cele mai bune practici care putem să le adaptăm la contextul național și să mergem pe această cale. Mulțumesc frumos!
Mulțumim, doamnă Bușmachiu. Dacă mai sunt colegi, poftim, doamna secretară de stat.
Bună ziua, stimată vicepreședintă a Comisiei, stimate doamne deputate, colegi, dragi invitați. Eu, înainte de a trece la următorul subiect pe agenda, aș vrea să fac o mică clarificare, pentru că s-a făcut referință la prevederile Codului Penal al Republicii Moldova și cred că este foarte benefic aceste discuții exact în acest format, dar ca să fim cât mai concreți în recomandări sau să identificăm soluțiile cele mai pozitive și durabile, vreau să menționez că de fapt, utilizarea sau comercializarea drogurilor cu amănuntul este prevăzut în codul contravențional. Totodată vreau să specific, deci în cazul în care persoana își exprimă acordul să meargă la tratament sau să meargă într-o instituție medico-sanitară publică, ea deci este absolvită de răspundere inclusiv contravențională. Mai mult ca atât, avem și o altă prevedere în codul contravențional, care, apropo, era inițial propus să fie introdusă în codul penal. Este vorba de consumul ilegal public de droguri etnobotanice sau analogii acestora în locuri publice, asta fiind în special pentru a reduce consumul sau de a încuraja consumul acestor substanțe, în special în adiacentul instituțiilor de învățământ. Am vrut să fac clarificarea asta pentru că, în dependență de delimitările clare pe care deja le avem, să înțelegem cu toții care ar fi pașii următori în sensul modificărilor de ordin legislativ. Mulțumesc!
Mulțumim. Mai este vreo intervenție? Mai dorește cineva să ia cuvântul? Vă mulțumesc. Cred că sunt convinsă de fapt că toți cei care suntem aici prezenți avem aceeași intenție de a preveni și a reduce consumul de droguri, pentru că aceasta este o problemă mare de sănătate personală și sănătate publică și integrarea persoanei în toate procesele sociale. Totodată, probabil ne dorim cu toții ca traficul ilicit de droguri să fie în cantități cât mai mici, doar că din ceea ce am discutat în ultimii ani și în cadrul comisiei, dar și pe alte platforme, uneori avem viziuni diferite cum să realizăm acest lucru și cred că trebuie mai mult să discutăm despre asta ca să avem consens și să avem convingerea că metoda pe care o alegem pentru a preveni consumul și a oferi servicii calitative pentru persoanele consumatoare de droguri ca să-și trateze această dependență și să aibă o viață socială normală și a preveni traficul, eu cred că noi trebuie mai mult să discutăm, să înțelegem cum să realizăm aceste lucruri. E clar că trebuie să facem această diferență dintre consum, pentru că este o problemă mai mult legată de sănătate și aici probabil eforturile sunt mai mult pe Ministerul Educației, Ministerul Sănătății, Ministerul Muncii și Protecției Sociale, pentru că lucrurile sunt tare interconectate și avem problema legată de traficul ilicit de droguri și criminalitatea asociată cu drogurile și aici presiunea este mai mult pe Ministerul de Interne și noi trebuie să avem această înțelegere, să nu avem așteptări irealiste față de polițistul de sector atunci când este vorba de educația unui adolescent, astfel ca acesta să nu recurgă la consumul de droguri. Dar totodată trebuie să înțelegem că fără a lucra în echipă, fără ca specialiștii să comunice, să colaboreze la nivel de localitate, fără a forma o echipă în care să existe acest dialog, nu o să reușim să atingem aceste obiective. Vă mulțumim foarte mult și în continuare o să-i ofer cuvântul domnului Pavel Bem, care o să ne prezinte experiența Cehiei în acest sens și poate această prezentare o să ne ofere încă mai multe răspunsuri la întrebările care le avem. Domnul Bem, vă oferim cuvântul și vă mulțumim pentru faptul că ați acceptat participarea.
Good morning to everybody. Can I just check if you hear me correctly? Can I get a feedback?
Yes, all is good.
Fantastic. Honorable Vice President, distinguished representatives of Ministry of Interior, Health, Justice, Social Welfare, and other governmental authorities and also distinguished representatives of civil society and experts. Just allow me to share with you my thanks for inviting me to take part in this important event, multi-stakeholder national dialogue on drug policy in Moldova. I was asked originally to deliver two contributions. The first one, which will touch the issue of drug policy reform challenges for Moldova in the context of European integration. The second one, which should be focused at the experiences from the Czech Republic in coordinating the National Anti-Drug Commission and the overall drug strategy, and to look what other models in Europe exist, and maybe to spend some time thinking about the benefits, positives, as well as negatives. Unfortunately, I will not be able to spend all the time with you this morning, so I would like to connect these two contributions together. First, allow me to start with the first topic. What does that mean as far as the accession or integration obligations of Moldova responding to the integration process to European Union? In reality, at least in my country, in the Czech Republic, we see and understand that Moldova is a part of European community for centuries. So, frankly speaking, there are certain obligations, but in other words, I would very much suggest to take seriously in account the national, local conditions and environment and cultural traditions to respond to drug problem, probably even more than to look what the other European countries are doing. But as we know, the European Union drug strategy provides sort of an overarching political framework and priorities for EU drug policy identified by member states and EU institutions. The strategy is strongly embedded in the values of the European Union as well as in international agreements. It is complemented by action plans on drugs, currently the action plan for 2021 till 2025, which, building on the general framework provided by the strategy, enlist and describe specific actions to be implemented along with responsible actors and monitoring indicators. The EU drug strategy and action plan require a relative consensus among member states regarding the context of the document. However, there is no legal obligation for the member states or candidate states to adhere to these documents while formulating national drug policies. The EU drug policy documents are merely recommendations. Hence, the international and national level policies in the member states as well as candidate states reflect them currently to a varying extent, creating a mosaic of diverse responses to drug use. In general, all member states of EU focus their drug policies on the evidence, focus their policies on integrated, balanced, and multidisciplinary approach to the drugs phenomenon. The overall aim is to protect and promote adherence to international human rights standards and obligations in global drug policy perspective. Also enhancing the role of the EU as a global broker for a people-centered and human rights-oriented drug policy as a key target. Saying that, I probably should spend a few minutes by a certain criticism of European global drug policy approach, taking a nice title from the European Harm Reduction Network correlation associated with current European Parliament elections. And the title taken from the correlation European Harm Reduction Network for Moldova, and this is also the title for my presentation, is for a drug policy that makes Moldova safer and healthier. The criticism, I should start stating that despite billions spent in drug control, European drug policies in certain aspects have failed to protect the health and safety of our communities. Drug use is reaching in Europe historical records. New substances are entering the EU market every year. War on drug policies have been unable to stop the growing power of organized crime. Evidence shows that prevention, treatment, and harm reduction are necessary to save lives and protect our communities. But services for people who use drugs lack resources and political support. The 2024 European elections must bring a paradigm shift. Well, I'm curious if that happened. As I already said, drug use in Europe is at record levels, and the growing presence of new psychoactive substances, including, for example, not only new psychoactive synthetic substances, but also synthetic opiates, has raised the alarm. EU drug policy must be rebalanced, ending the current prioritization of law enforcement over health. Investment and support for selective and indicated prevention programs, evident informed voluntary treatment, life-saving harm reductions, including HIV and HCV prevention, opioid-assisted treatment, take-home naloxone, drug checking services, drug consumption rooms, for example, community-based and community-led services that can reach out to everyone in need. To ensure an integrated, holistic, and intersectional approach to drugs, EU health bodies must have a pivotal role in shaping EU drug policy. Drug policy should be mainstreamed across social, health, and economic policies and not be left at the hands of law enforcement alone. The EU institutions must mainstream an inclusive human rights and gender-based approach to drugs, including unequivocal support for the decriminalization of people who use psychoactive substances as a measure to remove stigma and improve access to services. Why I started with such a critical statement towards the EU drug policy in general, because when we hear that, we finally find out that EU countries, the so-called old member states, are to a certain extent in almost very similar situation to Moldova challenge. So looking at that reality and looking at the fact that no size fits all, and that responses to drug problem at the national level, comparing to the international standards, are very heterogeneous. And this is also the reality in most of European countries, including the Czech Republic. Looking at the progress which are currently occurring in Europe, I might highlight, for example, what is happening in Germany. As you probably heard, Germany has implemented partial decriminalization and legalization of recreational cannabis use. Additionally, a cannabis social club system is being established. That happened in April. Cannabis social clubs are expected to become a part of the drug policy approach in Germany from the 1st of July. So actually this is the current reality. And I noticed there, especially because of the fact that looking at the criminalization rate, as I remember well, approximately 9% of the prison population in Moldova is represented by the drug offenders. It's fantastic, and it has been already stated by the distinguished representative of UNODC that the approaches in the penitentiary system in Moldova are fantastic, actually, and also are a good example for the Czech Republic, taking seriously in account accessibility of sterile syringes and needles, thus the most effective prevention for spread of HIV and hepatitis C in the prison system. So these programs already exist in Moldova, and would like to congratulate you for that. Another country example, the Czech Republic has passed a bill just very currently to regulate the sale of psychoactive substances. What does that mean? They found out that the only way how to respond, the only effective way how to respond to emergence of new psychoactive substances on the illicit market is to start to regulate also the sale, also the production. So the Czech Republic has introduced the new term called psychomodulation substances, responding, for example, to the emergence of HHC, kratom, and other synthetic substances, drugs, cannabinoid on the illicit market, which is just generating tremendous public health and public safety hazard risks in our country. So the Czech Republic goal is to regulate in reality all psychoactive substances, not only those which are already legal, like alcohol or tobacco, but also those which are illegal, illicit. Another interesting example is from United Kingdom, launched the first regular drug checking service and began making naloxone available without a prescription. So naloxone distribution as the major prevention measure for dealing with the risk of opioid pandemic as we've seen for last at least 8 years in the United States, called the opioid crisis in the United States. So naloxone is a challenge not only for UK, but naloxone is also a challenge for Moldova as well as the Czech Republic. Another nice example, Ukraine legalized cannabis for medical use in February of this year, seen by some stakeholders as a way to address pain and post-traumatic stress disorder among civilians and soldiers. Well, the challenge of addressing the PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder related to the war on Ukraine from the Russian invaders, this is a great challenge actually, and in the Czech Republic, we are assisting Ukraine with providing another substance, not only medical cannabis to Ukraine, but also ketamine, which is a dissociative anestheticum used to treat effectively post-traumatic stress disorder. The last example, Scotland has approved a trial of an overdose prevention center in Glasgow. This allows Scotland to go ahead without awaiting approval from UK government, as a drug policy is a typical matter that is decided at the federal level and not devolved. So also this overdose prevention center is a challenge not only for Moldova, but as we've seen here, also for Scotland. So I shared with you these couple of examples to make clear that current drug policies in EU member states, or more generally in European countries, and we could say more developed European countries, but I don't like this label because it doesn't really reflect the national realities. And I use this example to show that most of drug policies in particular European member states are also changing through the time and very, very dramatically. The suggestion for, or maybe a recommendation for Moldova and Moldovan government could be embedded in several principles we designed within the European, Eastern and Central European and Central Asian Commission on Drugs, which is a part of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, and which is very much in line of the so-called European standards. The principle number one, based on this, is focused at science and evidence. So the recommendation is simple: base drug policy on evidence, because an evidence-based approach is fundamental for countries in order to pursue more effective drug policies, provide value for money, save the state budget in reality, and prevent negative collateral consequences. Europe in general has spent a lot of time on researching and monitoring so-called unintended negative consequences based by the historical approach to drug policies, based on simply or purely or in majority of invested energy and funds on law enforcement. The principle number two, from our perspective, is to prioritize people's and public health. Just simply put people's health and safety first. It's rewarding because this is the reality which is decreasing the number of those who will be in the original context at the end, let's say, victims of the law enforcement based and criminalization oriented drug policy. So people's and public health outcomes should be given a central place in shaping drug policies, because drug use is neither a medical condition nor does it necessarily lead to drug dependence. In reality, most of people who are using illicit psychoactive substances are not dependent on them. Only a very small part of them become dependent. But the part which is becoming dependent to various psychoactive substances, including alcohol certainly, are those which are being already affected by genetic factors, epigenetic factors, violence in primary family system, lack of the attachment, physical and sexual abuse. So in reality, most of, at least in the Czech Republic and other European countries, most of drug-dependent people are sick with the primary health conditions and mental conditions, which are leading to self-medication, thus using various psychoactive substances to heal or to treat themselves. So the priority is clear. The Europe currently is more and more focusing at people's health and safety first. The number 3 priority, which is very much linked to what I have already said, promote human rights in drug policy. Again, it's rewarding because it's not only protecting those using various psychoactive substances from stigmatization and criminalization, but also dramatically changing the health and mental, psychological, psychiatric conditions. Those already addicted or dependent on various psychoactive substances have, in average, 70 to 75% psychiatric comorbidity, including depression, major depression, various kinds of affective disorders, anxiety disorders, panic disorders, schizoaffective disorders, personality disorders. So this is something what is based on the reality of the primary experience from, let's say it in a short meaning, from the dysfunctional primary family system. So human rights based oriented or centered oriented drug policies is a so-called golden standard of European approach to drug problem. That also is linked to the another recommendation or principle, and criminalization of drug use and possession. That means change the current penal code, because decriminalization of drug use and possession for personal use are being recommended also by the United Nations institutions, WHO, for example, and supported by systemic scientific reviews showing that penalizing people who possess drugs for personal use does not anyhow prevent people from using drugs. Applying criminal sanctions to people for drug possession and use while causing no harm to others is disproportional. Moreover, the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan stated that a criminal record is a lifetime penalty, hampers reintegration of people into society. Criminal penalties contribute to over-incarceration, which is among the highest in the world in some Eastern and Central European countries. Another principle of so-called golden standard is reduce and aim at ending incarceration for drug offenses. This is much more difficult because, as we've heard from the previous discussion, there is a real difference between somebody who is using psychoactive substances for self-medication and thus, because of the primary family context and genetics and epigenetics and violence, physical and sexual abuse, abandonment, lack of the attachment, etc., all those is pushing those people to heal themselves through using psychoactive substances, certainly including alcohol. This is the number one, probably. On the other hand, we do have here those who are smuggling, producing, and just making financial benefits on that. So these two perspectives could be seen from the first glance absolutely unbalanceable. But in reality, the experience from most of European countries shows that this is not true. So ending incarceration for drug offenses is absolutely a legitimate goal. Especially Eastern Europe and Central Asia have one of the highest rates of incarceration globally. Drug offenses and non-violent property crime related to drug use, and this is typical because obviously those dependent on illicit substances, they are not employed, and they simply are searching for all possible ways to earn incomes. Certainly, as we talk about the property, the petty minor property crime, certainly it's an illegal activity. But all these significantly contribute to these incarceration rates. So specific approach might be designed towards these small non-violent property crimes of those who are simply being involved in the illicit drug markets because of their disease, because they are sick. Another important principle, I would say golden standard, is ensure access to evidence-based treatment for drug dependence. And Moldova has various, I would say, a very well-developed treatment programs, therapeutic communities, as well as harm reduction interventions. Evidence-based treatment for drug dependence should certainly follow the international European standards. Treatment should be voluntary, with informed consent, offering an integrated set of care that address the health as well as social, so legal needs, be based on realistic and individualized treatment plans. We obviously use the name case management. Be appropriate and accessible, particularly for stigmatized group of people, ethnic minorities, or sometimes, for example, prisoners. In most of European countries, the accessibility of proper treatment differs in community compared to the prison system. So this is also the challenge for Europe. The opioid substitution treatment as a major, most effective treatment intervention for those addicted to opioid, heroin, opium, codeine analogs, or those substances which are in a medical space being used for the opioid substitution. So number one opioid substance in the Czech Republic is not heroin anymore, as buprenorphine. That means Subutex and Suboxone, which are used to treat and to assist those dependent to opioid, but certainly the leakages to the illicit market occurs, and as a reality of that, this substance which is used for substitution is being smuggled and sold on the black market in the Czech Republic, and the Czech Republic is not the only country in Europe. Why I spent such a time on OST or OAT? Because it's not only effective, but if you look at the accessibility, even in the Czech Republic, where we do have the experience of 30 years of substituting the opioid-dependent person, the coverage of the opioid substitution treatment is approximately 35–36%. So the majority of also opioid-dependent person in the Czech Republic are not substituted. So in my country, we have the same challenge as you do. What I see as extremely important is that Moldova has the good experience, the good practice experience with providing the OSTs, the substitution therapy, also for prisoners. Even though, again, the accessibility might vary from 20 to 25%, but it's from that perspective, I would say that Moldova belongs already to the European pioneers in that. Another golden standard or principle is linked to various administrative and legal obstructions in providing the access to controlled substances listed on the UN Convention's annexes. And as a result of that, in reality, almost 80% of the global population around the world do not have access to pain relief medicine and other controlled substances for purely medical purposes. So to ensure the access to controlled substances for medical purposes is another key target. An effective and efficient drug policy should ensure full access to controlled substances, morphine, methadone, buprenorphine, all those included in the WHO model list of essential medicine, recognizing their critical role for pain management, pain relief, and also palliative care for those patients suffering from, for example, from the terminal stage of cancer, should be available, accessible, and decrease the suffering. So these golden standard principles, as I remember our discussion from last September, during our visit during the European and Eastern European and Central European and Central Asian Commission on Drugs as a part of the Global Commission on Drug Policy. During that visit, we have shared with the Moldovan experts and representatives of Ministry of Health and also Ministry of Interior and also the members of the Parliament, very much supportive to majority of priorities I have already stated. Now, when I jumped into the other topic in very, very, very brief time, I very much appreciate all these steps which happened through our last visit in September 2023 and nowadays. I may recall the letter from the chairman of the Eastern and Central European and Central Asian Commission on Drugs, the former president of Poland, Mr. Aleksander Kwaśniewski, who has prioritized several aspects of the Moldovan reality. And the first priority was based on the fact that in order to coordinate the drug policy reform, there should, or probably there must be, an independent coordinating body, governmental authority. And the question is, what is the power and what is the role of such a coordinating body? In Moldova, such a body exists for a long time, as far as I know. Maybe in last 2 or 3 years was quite inactive, but in last months, the necessary work was catalyzed, and I am very, very pleased for that. The question is, when I use the term independent body, does that mean that it should be the so-called a state governmental agency, another state institutions similar to those already exist in the former Moldovan governmental structure, or it's enough to have a sort of a coordination or coordinating body with a limited powers, with respect to already existing powers of certain governmental agencies and existing ministries, Minister of Health, Minister of Social Welfare, Minister of Interior, Justice, etc. In the Czech Republic, we have experience of 30 years of having such a coordinating body under the umbrella of the Office of the Government. Currently, such a commission is led by the Prime Minister. The National Drug Coordinator has political powers and is being nominated as a vice chairman of such a commission. And if I remember well, probably in February or March, I have shared with you, with my Moldovan colleagues, not only the fundamental cornerstones of the Czech drug strategy and action plan, but also the statute of the governmental council. That means this coordinating body for drug coordination, and also the rules of procedure. So all these documents might be used in Moldovan context. However, I would very much suggest to adjust that to your national, local needs. The other significant comment, or maybe allow me to spend 1 minute also on other options. In some European countries, even though not so many, there has been designed and implemented a governmental agency with clearly specified powers, with the budget allowing not only to design drug strategy and formulate the action plans, but also to implement the programs. Because, for example, in the Czech Republic, in the early 90s, when we for the first time designed and introduced the Governmental Council on Drugs, I was a chairman of this governmental body. 3 years of only declarative plans with very limited implementation impact in reality. So finally I realized that to make a step further, I just need to ask the government and also the parliament to approve the budget And it happened. And that reality dramatically has changed the so-called effectiveness or cost-benefit-oriented drug policy in my country. Currently in the Czech Republic, we have introduced a bill which is aimed at setting up such a state independent agency. Also, this is an example that in the Czech Republic, with such a long history of quite a good coordination of drug policy, we still have many challenges.
Pavel, I'm sorry for interrupting you. Can you hear me?
If you allow me, I would finally like to congratulate you not only for organizing the mighty stakeholder national dialogue on drug policy in Moldova, but also by already undertaking the necessary steps towards creating a good, maybe golden standard of Moldovan drug policy, which will be a part of so-called golden EU standards to respond to drug problems. Thank you very much, and I wish all the best to you. And the Czech Republic Governmental Office on Governmental Commission on Drugs is just ready to support Moldovan experts and governmental representatives in any sense which will appear. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best.
Da, vă mulțumim, domnul Ben, pentru discursul dumneavoastră și ideile pe care ați vrut să mi le oferiți. Foarte multe. Înțeleg că avem despre ce discuta și noi avem multe discuții la acest subiect. Acum am să-i ofer cuvântul, un pic o să ne reținem, o să depășim un pic programul, să-i ofer cuvântul doamnei Aliona Curbatova să ne prezinte experiența Estoniei și am să o rog într-un timp cât mai eficient să auzim care a fost parcursul Estoniei în procesul acesta de aderare și ce modificări s-au întâmplat în Estonia. Poftim, doamna Curbatova.
Yes, just to check if you can hear me.
We can, thank you.
Yes, first of all, distinguished members of parliaments and colleagues from governmental, international and community organizations, thank you for having me here. Being mindful of time, I will try to concentrate on more specifically only on our experience in Estonia and maybe not be repetitive on the aspects more related on how EU works. And in Estonia, we went through the process of integration with European Union almost 20 years ago now, in 2004, and following a 6-year period of accession negotiations. And what is important is that back then we were in a very different situation than you are right now. And also European drug policy was very different from what it is right now. So you today have significantly more achievements and positive experience also in terms of national drug policy than we had 20 years ago. And in Estonia back then, we were the country with the highest rate of new HIV cases. We had one of the biggest, still have one of the biggest opioid problems, and we had almost no services for people who use drugs, and we had a very punitive criminal policy. So we had to make a lot of changes also, which you probably today do not have to make because you're already somewhat in a better position when you compare yourself to European drug policy than we were back then. But if we look back at the whole process of joining the EU, and being in the position when we had to, in a way, adhere to European drug policy, what was the most important thing for us and one of the valuable things for us is that we basically had to review all of our activities and see how they correspond to the European Union policies in more wider aspect, also to the European drug policy. And that allowed us perhaps self-reflection that we did not undertake before that. So we were quite happy on national level with what we had without actually realizing how difficult the situation was. And this process of having to evaluate and how you compare to different European policies, including the drug policies, was actually one of the first big developments, I think, in our national drug policy. We had access to a lot more knowledge, to comparable data, and although it was already stated that European policies are not law, in that sense that we didn't have to legally adhere to European drug policy, but there was a soft peer pressure by neighboring countries, by other EU countries who saw the gravity of a problem in Estonia, who very strictly advised us to take European golden standard, as it was mentioned, more seriously and to actually start implementing it more on national level. But essentially, what it led to was an elaboration of a new drug policy. And in 2005, we adopted a new drug policy until 2012. So that was a significant change from the approach to the drug policy we had before that, because before that we were mainly oriented towards prevention and different alcohol. We looked at alcohol and drugs together, so we tried to be very general in a way in our perception of drug policy. But moving on is that nothing stays the same. It's one of the main things that you have to accept when you start the process of the change, is that joining EU and having these EU policies as a standard is not a miracle medicine. Because during this process, a lot of changes were made to formally adhere and in a way that was essentially minimal to be acceptable, but there wasn't sufficient understanding of why they are necessary and how to move forward from their own. And Estonia, for example, decriminalized drug use and possession of small quantity for personal use very early on. So we've had that for 20 years now, but and we do actually analyze the drugs to determine whether it's a small quantity or not, and we do not take into consideration the weight of added substances. But still, what we could not foresee, and what, for example, European policy, drug policy at that point in time did not guide us through, is that by approaching this way, and we were very proud of that change, that we disproportionately punished people who were more marginalized, so who would possess for their personal need more drugs than would be qualified as a small quantity. And we had and still have a very vague definition of small quantity, which is basically defined as a quantity needed to intoxicate 10 people without previous experience of drug use. So joining the European Union and having to adapt our national policies and legislation to EU policies did give us some benefits, but it also kind of highlighted that based on what your national situation is, you might not even have recommendations on European levels that you would need to follow. And for Estonia, that was defined as a very grave situation with synthetic opioids. We were very unique in that sense. So we still had to learn a lot ourselves by doing. So how to adapt more general European policy guidelines to a local need and legislation. Learning that cost effectiveness does not mean that harm reduction or treatment services are cheap. They are more cost effective than punishment will ever be, but you still need to invest significant amounts of resources to have treatment and harm reduction services with the coverage and with the content that actually addresses your national need. And this is something that you cannot really take over from general policies. There are a lot of guidelines that you can take into consideration. But basically, you always have to keep in mind what your local situation is. And it can be drastically different from what is happening in your neighboring countries even. And there is always some kind of experience in the community. And the good thing with European Union community, despite the fact that, yes, European drug policy also has its flaws, and by far not all the countries in EU actually do implement all the recommendations, is that you have this wealth of experience. You have, for example, European drug monitoring agencies that can basically link you to any organization or any partner in any country if you need some additional knowledge on what is happening right now in your country, how to put it into perspective to see whether other countries have been in a similar experience or not, what they have done, has it helped or not. So, but it always comes back to how you use that possibility. How much do you actually learn from what the other people, other countries have done? And although we were initially guided by this external pressure to be a part of European Union family, to have a more progressive, human rights oriented, public health oriented drug policy, eventually it was a very slow and gradual shift on national level on how the drug policy were actually moved forward, how our policy was planned, and what activities were implemented. Now we have a national drug policy until 2030. It has a narrower focus on psychoactive substances, which are illicit substances. And we have an intersectoral governmental expert group on drugs, which is led by the Ministry of Interior. And this was one of those things that we also learned during the process, is that if initially it was the Ministry of Social Affairs, which in Estonia also is the Ministry for Health, which was leading, because at some point in our history of drug policy, that ministry did not have the capacity to actually lead the drug policy for many different reasons we cannot go into today. Another ministry was ready to take the charge. So we did not stick to the initial role division, but it was decided that if there is a ministry which is willing to accept that, although the Ministry of Interior is responsible for the more punitive measures, that the drug policy is still led by the principle of public health, then this change is possible. And actually it has proven very good for Estonia, because for quite many years, the police and Ministry of Interior was able to bring into perspective the actual amount of work that they have to do if there is no sufficient support services, if people are overly incarcerated, so how many work hours they have to spend working on arresting the same people who would benefit way more and could have positive change in their life if instead they would be advised for counseling services and treatment services. We also have a prevention council, which is led by rotation by different ministries. We don't have, for example, a separate agency, and this is, again, that you always have to take into account what your country is like. We are a very small country. There are simply not enough people, qualified people, knowledgeable people on drug policy in the governmental system to be able to man different commissions and different working structures. So during the last 10 years, we have been consolidating more and more work of different commissions, which has basically cleared up a lot of working time for people to actually look more in depth into different areas of work. We do fund on state level prevention, harm reduction and treatment services. And where we are right now is a basic understanding is that positive change for people does not mean sobriety. So stopping the use of drugs is not the primary goal of the drug policy currently. It's improving the situation. It's achieving the positive change on community level and in person's life, which may mean less use, which may mean more safer use, for example, but it all essentially leads to lower cost for community. Another thing that we came to is that we tried to be very regulatory in terms of services. We looked at the experience from other EU countries, and we wanted to have a strong set of standards for different services, and essentially we over-regulated the services for people who use drugs. We had higher expectations for drug treatment than we have for psychiatric treatment in general. And if you want to treat this problem as part of a wider perspective of public health, then basically you have to accept that we don't expect people with other diagnoses to be able to change as we tell them to change and in a short time perspective, but yet we somehow did that for people who use drugs. We had completely unrealistic expectations on what and how they should be able to do when they join harm reduction or treatment programs. So this is something that we have also gradually tried to move away from. People are people. People will relapse. People will not be motivated, perhaps at some points of time, to change their behavior. They will not feel need for it. What we as a government should do, and today European drug policy also has a lot of recommendations regarding how to do that, is to minimize the harm. And that is one very important area of work for us. And it was mentioned that several times that the role of criminal law and criminal policy is very important. And yes, in Estonia, it took us approximately 10 years. I hope, and I know that you are further away already than we were initially, but I hope that it doesn't take you as much time. When we first changed the criminal acts to allow diversion by police and prosecutor's office to social and treatment services, again specifying that it doesn't have to be treatment and that the end result doesn't have to be that the person stops using drugs. Now we are in a process when we are again reviewing the criminal law, and the idea behind the current process is to differentiate the punishments for drug handling crimes according to the danger of the act. So basically that means that we want to move away from the current system when we still, for example, punish people who use drugs for petty crimes, so for stealing, for buying drugs for their own purpose, etc. We also want to differentiate based on whether, even if the quantity exceeds what currently is considered as a small quantity, whether it's for personal use or not, because we're still in this situation, and with the influx of synthetic opioids in Europe in general, is that other countries will be facing it too, when a person who uses synthetic opioids will have daily on the person an amount of drug, which would be considered a large quantity in any situation. So there are a lot of things which are very nation-specific. European Union drug policy gives a framework that you can use to support your internal processes, but essentially it's up to you to keep what is already good and to improve what is not working. And I will not be giving any recommendations here, but because we all of us are working based on what is needed for our countries, more specifically, and I'm not that well adversed in what is happening in Moldova right now. But I will finish my speech with an example, is that a week ago, we had a publication. It was a journalistic experiment, which basically meant that a group of journalists using a rapid drug test went to every European Parliament election party our politicians had. Basically, we had 7 parties, I think, on election day, and they went to every party and they swiped the toilets, the tables, and other surfaces for cocaine. And the swipes were positive in 6 cases out of 7. So 6 parties out of 7 gave positive results. Arguably, it does not mean, it does not say who has been using, it does not say when exactly the drug has been used. But essentially, when we're talking about a drug policy, and what is important is that we have a lot of stereotyping in the society, and we tend to also elaborate our national policies based on that stereotyping. So I have this vision of who the people are who have problems and what should be done for them. Essentially, we're talking about the community in general. Drug use happens in all population groups. So the main guidance for us when we work on national policies nowadays, and I speak from experience being a part of the group that developed the recent drug policy, is that yes, we have international standards, we have European drug policy, strategy, action plan, we have epidemiological situation, but essentially when you plan the activities, legislation, is that you have to think on how would you want someone you love to be treated if that person happens to use drugs. So, and this is also this kind of, something that we check the measures against. I know it sounds a bit romantic perhaps, and something that is not very suitable for a serious discussion now on policy and legislation. But this is a legislation and policy we do to help people live safer and healthier. So for us, it seems to be a rather pragmatic principle to take into consideration. Thank you.
Mulțumim, doamna Curbatova, pentru faptul că ne-ați comunicat prin ce a trecut Estonia. A fost foarte interesant să ascultăm evoluțiile prin care ați trecut și descoperirile la care ați ajuns. Și vă mulțumim pentru mesajul de încurajare. Da, într-adevăr, noi trebuie la nivel național să găsim cele mai potrivite soluții care se pliază pe nevoile noastre naționale, dar totodată având în vedere niște principii generale, așa numitele principii de aur ale Uniunii Europene. Și cred că toți au înțeles aici că efortul trebuie să fie al nostru. Partenerii europeni pot doar să ne povestească despre experiența lor, dar deciziile trebuie să le adoptăm noi. Decizii nu simple, complicate, dar nu o să mai avem timp să ezităm în aceste decizii și trebuie să ne mișcăm mai repede pe anumite lucruri. Vă mulțumesc foarte mult pentru participarea la prima etapă. Da, poftim.
Добрый день, коллеги. Виталий Рыбинчук, Общественная ассоциация «Полс Коммунитар». Наша организация занимается мониторингом и адвокацией в области наркополитики. И один момент, на который хотим обратить внимание, касается комментария в законотворчестве. Постановление правительства, где указаны пороговые величины для различных веществ, которые привлекаются к административной либо к уголовной ответственности, раньше формулировка, которая была, на сегодняшний день исчезла, которая решает два вопроса. Первое. Ну, давайте лучше скажу, какая формулировка, и вы поймете, какие два вопроса решают. Указанные величины в этой постановлении, они в самом конце постановления мелким шрифтом написано, что они указаны в агрегатном состоянии. Другими словами, после спектрного анализа только тогда можно опираться на эти величины, которые там указаны, а не на общую массу. Это вот единственный комментарий, и для законотворцев я специально сделал этот комментарий для того, чтобы обратить внимание. Надо вернуть эту формулировку, чтобы и тогда решится вопрос о том, что даже, может быть, величины не надо поднимать и увеличивать. Просто написать, указанные в agregatном состоянии.
Da, mulțumim. Noi după pauza care urmează o să avem în a doua parte a evenimentului de astăzi discuții mai mult despre legislația noastră, despre evoluțiile și lucrurile care se întâmplă la moment. De ce o să avem posibilitate poate să auzim și opinia instituțiilor statului cu privire la această propunere și la acest aspect. Acum eu vă invit pe toți să nu plecați de la eveniment, pentru că urmează a doua parte, poate cea mai consistentă. Vă invit acum să facem o pauză de cafea. Ea este în cantina Parlamentului, aici la etajul 1. Noi o să vă conducem. Haideți să ne luăm până la 11:15 este bine? Da? Și la 11:15 revenim în această sală.